Welcome to Martechify, a community of marketing professionals interested in digital marketing, martech, and AI. I'm your host today, Ekaterina Konovalova, and I'm very excited to welcome to this conversation Stefanie O'Connell. Stefanie is an award-winning journalist. She's also a speaker, and she's an author of the Ambition Penalty book. So today we'll talk about career ambition and how to thrive in modern world. Stefanie, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
So let's talk about your career journey and what inspired you to write the book.
Yeah, so I had been covering personal finance and specifically women's experiences in the workplace and trying to grow their wealth, whether it was asking for a raise or investing in the stock market. And what I found consistently is how often they would try to do all of the quote unquote right things and still not be able to access the same outcomes or equitable pay or wealth or representation as their male peers. And so that really inspired me to dig into some of the things we learn about women in the workplace and all of our workplaces in general and how they operate and how those workplaces continue to produce a lot of the same old inequalities, even as the people who come from more underrepresented and marginalized identities do lean in and do ask for more and do all of these quote unquote right things. And that's what's really inspired me to research and write my book, The Ambition Penalty, how corporate culture tells women to step up and then pushes them down, which I think is a lesson for all of us, not just women, in how we foster our ambition in the workplace in a way that works better for everyone.
Wonderful. And let's first shed the light on some of the myths and challenges that you see these days. Maybe we can unpack some statistics and then think about how we can close the gap and help people advance in their career without coming across as too ambitious, too aggressive, where they actually feel harmonious with how they behave and getting the results that they want.
Yes. So oftentimes we hear that, women aren't able to access the same outcomes because they're simply not as ambitious as their male peers. This is a very common myth. This idea that they're not confident enough, they're not assertive enough, that they're not willing to really speak up and go after the things they want. And what I came across in the data time and time again was that you would have women negotiating just as often, being just as assertive, just as confident, and yet they were not only less likely to be able to access the same rewards, the pay raises or the promotions, for example, they were also more likely to face backlash and even penalties for even asking. So being labeled unlikable or not a team player or not the right fit. And those things had real consequences for their careers. In some cases, it just meant that they were not given the same mentorship going forward, or that they were given poor performance appraisals because they were seen as difficult to work with for simply asserting themselves. In other cases, it was more extreme. I had interviewed women who had job offers even rescinded when they attempted to negotiate their salaries, again, using all of the quote unquote best practices. And now, this was not just anecdotal evidence. Of course, I do interview many, many women for this book, and their stories are featured throughout it. But I want to make clear that this is all in the empirical peer-reviewed research as well. So, for example, there is a paper called The Dynamics of Gender and Alternative in Negotiations. And the professor who did this research analyzed the results of over 2,500 negotiators to understand why women were experiencing worse negotiation outcomes. She was looking into all of these familiar explanations. Were they being less assertive? Were they negotiating less frequently? Were they doing so less effectively? And she didn't find any evidence of any of those things. What she found is that women were less likely to get what they asked for, not because they weren't being assertive, but because they were. And women's assertiveness challenges gender stereotypes of how women, quote unquote, should behave, which is an ideal of womanhood that is very limiting when you're talking about a corporate or professional environment where you want people to be competitive and to be assertive. And those stereotypes of womanhood are in direct conflict with those stereotypes of what it means to be a good professional and a good leader. So the stereotypes of womanhood are often about being compassionate and being warm and always putting others' interests before your own. And maybe more to the point, It's about not being aggressive. It's about not being assertive or ambitious. And so it was this violation of gender stereotypes that triggered backlash against women rather than their negotiation tactics in and of themselves, because the same tactics were being rewarded in their male peers. But of course, this leaves us with a major double bind. If having access to equal opportunity, power, and pay depends on our willingness to ask for more, and women aren't, quote unquote, supposed to ask for more, how do we get ahead, right? How do you act on your ambitions, particularly in the workplace or in leadership, when you're more likely to be punished for having those ambitions in the first place? And that's what's really the crux of my book, really kind of pulling back not only the myths and misconceptions about what drive these inequalities, but how we can think more critically about what it is that actually drives them.
And how can women advocate for themselves without coming across as aggressive and being perceived unfavorably?
So there are many quote unquote best practices for any negotiator. Like the skills of negotiation are pretty uniform, and for some, certain parts of these skills are more important than others. For women specifically, very, very important to lean on cooperative framing instead of competitive framing for achieving what they want. So, how the contributions that they are making within a company are really serving the company and the bottom line. Pretty basic best negotiation practices, but even more so for women, especially demonstrating their interests in what they're going to do to make other people look good, really, I guess, playing into that gender stereotype of women not being self-serving but serving others as a way of advocating for themselves. But I think what my book really reckons with is the limitations of that. There's no amount of doing that that's going to solve for a a culture in which women are not really seen as leaders and are not allowed, quote unquote, to be aggressive and assert themselves in the ways that their male peers are. And by the same token, you're not going to get to a more functional workplace when that workplace demands that men always be aggressive and competitive too, and not be collaborative and compassionate and looking out for others in the way women are expected to. So I just want to say that the gender stereotypes that drive the backlash against women are actually limiting for everyone at work. If men aren't expected to, let's say, partake in caretaking responsibilities at home because the workplace says, we want you to be committed to your career and we expect everyone to not take the paternity leave that they are entitled to, that has a consequence for women, certainly, and also for men. And so a lot of this deconstruction, some of the highest costs are borne by women. But what I do point out is that we all pay those costs in the end in some form or another.
Yeah, that's a good point. And then, based on your research, and I'm sure you looked at many companies, maybe there's some outliers that are really leading the way and show more equitable opportunities, not just claiming it, but also living it. Do you have any examples?
I do. I do. So, in each chapter of the book, I break down some of the data driven solutions to some of these workplace problems. And again, there's many chapters in the book, so there's a lot of different ones. But certainly some of the common themes are transparency, whether that's transparency in pay or simply reporting representation of women or underrepresented groups in positions of leadership, not even having necessarily a DEI program, even just reporting who is represented on the team really helps facilitate accountability and helps people check some of their biases and realize maybe some of their blind spots in a way that can actually be pretty transformative. So accountability and transparency are some of the two key ingredients in terms of facilitating more equitable workplaces. And one of the case studies I give of this is from the company Buffer, and they had a very well publicized policy of pay transparency that they implemented at their organization. And what was really interesting is that as soon as Buffer implemented not only the transparency around what people were making, but the formula for determining salary at the company based on a whole bunch of different factors, they found that their gender wage gap actually started to grow. So it grew from 4% in 2015 to 9% in 2018 and as high as 15% in 2019. Now, in response to this, a lot of companies might say something like, well, that's just tells us that, women really weren't interested in the high paying roles after all, and that there's something about what women are doing or not choosing to do that is creating these gender gaps. But that's not what Buffer did. Instead, they did what I would encourage everyone to do, other than implementing transparency and accountability in their workplaces, is to get curious about where gaps are emerging once you have the data to study those gaps. And what they did was they found that people's salaries were primarily determined by their roles within the company. And a lot of the highly paid positions at the company had been male dominated. So instead of just saying, oh, women just don't have the skills for these high paying engineering roles, or women aren't interested in leadership positions, they used the information to address that kind of occupational segregation that had emerged in their workplace. So they reevaluated their hiring and recruitment policies. They started working with women in engineering groups to diversify the engineering applicant pool. Because it was a small company and a growing company, there was also this realization that every single new hire or every departure or, every new function, business function or new role at the company would really make a significant change to the pay distribution within the company. And so they created accountability mechanisms for reinforcing their commitment to equitable pay policies that not only were like a one and done implementation procedure of publicizing what the roles were and what the gender breakdown was, but that was constantly a consistent practice of checking in on how they were doing, how they were keeping accountable, even as things shifted within the company, so that they were considering all employees and any relevant changes to their roles. And then because of the executive team's outsized influence on the distribution of compensation within the company, they really made it a priority to increase women's representation in those key leadership roles. So by 2021, Buffer had closed their gender pay gap by 10 percentage points. And by the following year, their gender pay gap had dropped to less than 1%. So I think it's a really interesting case study because they start out with doing a lot of these best practices and then they see things get worse. And then they say, well, maybe this best practices is giving us important information about how we're still falling short. And then they continue to iterate until they get to more equitable outcomes. And I think it's that kind of commitment and curiosity that is really required to reshape work in a way that works better for everybody.
Yes. And hopefully more companies will take note and follow the footsteps of Buffer. I know you have some very interesting statistics in your book about very small changes can make a huge difference over time.
Mm.
So let's talk about it.
Yes. So this is from a paper called Insidious Nonetheless, How Small Effects and Hierarchical Norms Create and Maintain Gender Disparities in Organizations. And what it really sought to do is to quantify the collective impact of these kind of small, everyday microaggressions, the sexism that comes up and isn't really necessarily hugely blatant or explicit, but is there all the same. And the way that the authors did this is that they reviewed all of the empirical literature and sought to recreate a lot of those same small variations in things like women getting less credit than men, or having their successes valued a little lower, or having their failures penalized just slightly more, having their women's potential under recognized, and of course, having women who advocate for themselves being more likely to be penalized for self-promotion. And so what the study authors did is they just set this at a 3% level of bias for all of these different factors in evaluations. And so what they then did was simulate what happens if you have a man and woman starting their careers at the same time and they maintain the same performance throughout. But what happens when you have that very, very small level of bias over time is that a woman who starts out in an entry level position winds up needing 17 performance review cycles to get to the executive level, while her male counterpart starting at the same level, same time, same performance, only needs 8 performance reviews to get to the same level, and he needs to complete half as many projects successfully. So it's a really important paper, I think, in terms of understanding how a small amount of this kind of everyday bias really grows into enormous gaps that not just create the inequity we see in workplace leadership and pay, but also in terms of the gap we see in terms of people's exhaustion and their burnout and their disillusionment with work itself.
Interesting. And a lot of our audience is in marketing and technology. And typically, big tech companies are leading the way in the United States with paternal policies, paternal leave, maybe giving more generous vacation. So, have you had a chance to compare different industries and see the trends and dynamics across industries?
Yeah, it's pretty shocking how consistent some of these dynamics remain across industries. One of the things I will say about tech specifically is that it is incredibly male dominated, and male dominated workplaces, particularly those that are dominated in terms of leadership, uh, are some of the overwhelmingly most hostile to women in the workplace, meaning women in those environments are far more likely to face harassment. They're far more likely to be underrecognized, undervalued, underpromoted, underpaid. And, we talked about like this idea of a 3% gender bias and what a difference it makes. Those kinds of biases are far more amplified in male dominated workplaces. And so I have a whole chapter in the book where I kind of dig into this, and I start with women in tech, some of the interviews and the research around women in tech, and I transition into women's experiences in the military and in blue collar work and in construction. And it's really remarkable because there's such different kinds of environments. And as you mentioned, like tech does have some of the most progressive seeming policies in all of corporate America. And yet, the experiences women are having on the ground and in practice are remarkably similar to those of these other more explicitly hostile environments for women, and in positions where we don't have access to those kinds of generous benefits. And so one of the things I talk about in the book is that there's a lot of different levels to cultivating better workplaces. There's the interpersonal, that's the kind of relationships you have among peers, with bosses, with mentorship, certainly whatever's happening in your own private life, in your home. Then you have the institutional level. So this is the workplace, the policies, the practices. And then you have the political and cultural level. And that is where, let's say, not only the legislation and the policy that's in place, but also what are the values of the culture about actually using those policies. One really fascinating paper looked at what happens if you have a workplace where there is access to paid parental leave, for example. And the best predictor of whether men would utilize that parental leave that they were entitled to in the workplace was not what they wanted and needed. It was not what their partners wanted and needed. It was what other men at the workplace thought men should do. And I think it's a really, really important example to understanding the different layers of what facilitates or prevents meaningful change, because it's not just enough to have a policy. You also have to have a culture where it's expected that you will utilize those kinds of benefits, and everyone will utilize those benefits and not be penalized if they do.
Yes, and it almost reminds me of the vacation policy because in the United States, I see some overall positive change, but still, if you compare it to many European countries, people are embarrassed to take vacation, or even though they may be entitled to take time off and they'll be more productive, in Europe and France, they're just living and will get back to work the next day. While in the US, so many workplaces might still expect people to check in at night or on the weekends or while they're traveling on vacation with kids. Fortunately, there are a lot of positive examples where I see different culture that is more progressive, but it really reminds me the vacation policy as well as paternal leave policy on a cultural level.
That's right. There are so many of these different kinds of policies, and it's again not just about what's written on paper, but how does it play out in practice? Who is going to be penalized? And are those penalties different depending on the identity of the person who's taking them? These are all the kinds of things we need to be considering.
Absolutely. Stephanie, let's talk about what then a healthy ambition may look like and what can current leaders, especially in our marketing field, for example, what can they do to support people who are ambitious without penalizing them?
Yeah, so I just want to be clear that when I talk about ambition, I don't think ambition is a job title. I don't think it's a salary. I don't think it's an amount of money in a bank account. I often talk about public and professional ambition because that is the ambition that shows up in ways that vary differently across identity. And for women especially, they face a lot of different barriers to accessing the same rewards and return on their ambition as their male peers. So I think about healthy ambition for everyone is about like thinking very expansively about the things we want and the things and supports we need to get it, and really trying to bring what we do into alignment with those ambitions, whatever they are. And maybe more importantly, for the purposes of this conversation and thinking about what it takes to make workplaces more supportive of that more expansive view and aligned view of what ambition is, a kind of ambition that does not rely on undermining other people or undervaluing them. And so a lot of modern workplace culture is really still very much contingent upon this idea that your 9 to 5 workday, or honestly, even longer nowadays when we're constantly accessible, will never be interrupted. You will never need a break at any point in your 40-year plus career path, and you will never need to take a day off either to care for yourself or someone else. And that vision of work really does not work for people, for anyone, especially not for women. The reason it works for women less than men is because women are much more likely to be the ones picking up the slack when somebody has to cut back to deal with an unexpected snow day at school and someone has to watch the kids. And there are these gender dynamics that leave women carrying so much more of this unpaid domestic load, even when women earn more, even when they are more ambitious, even when it really doesn't make sense. The constraints of the culture, as things we've been talking about already, things like policy, things like cultural norms, really shift that burden overwhelmingly onto women, but in ways that really constrain us all. And so instead of kind of doubling down on, this very rigid idea of the ideal worker who's never interrupted and never has any needs outside of the workplace, I think we can think about creating environments that allow us to combine our professional and our personal ambitions more sustainably across identity. So not just having policies that are very transparent or that are keeping people accountable, but also really creating more opportunity for autonomy. And sometimes autonomy looks like flexibility, having control over maybe where you work or when you work, or even if you're in a job that, you have to be on site somewhere, it does have more rigid structures. There's a great example. I think it's the economist, the Nobel Prize winning economist Claudia Golden, who saw what happened in among pharmacists when they really adopted policies that, in a workplace that require them to be certain places at a certain time with that kind of rigid structure, but in ways that allow them to switch shifts more easily with others, pay gaps went down considerably. So, there's often these excuses around, why we can't make things more flexible, why things can't become more autonomous, why we can't give people more leeway. And I think that's just a failure of imagination. And I think COVID was a really great example of the ways that workplaces can reinvent themselves when they're incentivized to do so. And I think we should maintain that imagination. And there is no reason that any particular workplace setting should be excluded from that, or any kind of rule should be excluded from that. And as I said, I understand that not every single company is going to have policies that work the same. Nurses are not going to be working remotely for the most part. That said, when you have this kind of shorter shifts, for example, or nursing is a great example, being on 4 days, off 4 days, being able to switch easily with other people, that really enables people to pursue their personal and professional ambitions a little bit more sustainably with greater autonomy and making work better in a way that works for them, and as a result, for all of us.
Absolutely. And I think you have some statistics in your book or mention how many women are forced into part-time work and then
Mm.
lose on retirement contributions or maybe getting health insurance. So there's some trade-offs and challenges where they're not only losing income by being the default parent, caregiver, taking care of elderly parents, but also missing out on other benefits as well.
That's right. You're missing out on future career growth, pay raises, certainly the contributions your employer makes to your 401k or whatever your retirement plan is, the compounding returns on those contributions that aren't made. That cascades into huge, not just pay gaps, but wealth gaps, which is particularly significant for women because they are the primary caregivers of children, and not just children, but of everyone. They provide the vast majority of elder care. It's their incomes that researchers find are overwhelmingly relied on to meet those kinds of household needs, whereas men's incomes are often much more set aside for their own interests. So, the caretaking also winds up showing up in how men's and women's money is channeled. So, having something that impacts women's wealth in these really these substantial ways is a huge problem for literally everyone, because everyone depends on women.
Yes, basically the economy, the future of humanity, if they give birth and raise children.
Literally, right? Literally. And women live longer. I mean, so them not having access to the same levels of wealth is a problem because, they have to make their money last longer. So there's just so many cascading effects of these inequities, and it's really important that we don't overlook them.
So let's close on a positive note. Can you think
Yes.
of any ideas, advice, how we can propel the society to a bright future and make a change, and maybe come up with some examples that we can look at and be inspired?
So I just want to point out that when we see that women's outcomes improve, we generally see that everybody's outcomes improve. There's so much data that we find women's well-being going up, everyone's well-being going up, men's included. So one example is an analysis of 2 decades of data across 140 countries by the International Monetary Fund finds that greater gender equality is associated with lower income inequality and lower wealth inequality more broadly for everybody. Another analysis of 156 countries over a decade finds greater gender equality is associated with also longer longer life expectancy for both men and women. Gender equality is also positively correlated with GDP per capita. So when gender inequality is low, people tend to enjoy both higher incomes and higher standards of living, according to the World Economic Forum's Global Gender Gap Index. Those kinds of correlations also come across metrics of work-life balance and well-being. Greater gender equality is associated with more of both. By contrast, greater gender inequality is associated with greater wealth inequality, lower standards of living, lower work-life balance, lower well-being, lower lifespans, and greater anti-democratic tendencies and more acceptance of violence against women and all of these very, very bad outcomes that most of us can agree we don't want to see. So one of the big takeaways from my book is really understanding that there is a collective interest here, right? It's not just about you or me and my own ability to get more of what I want. It's about how do we facilitate conditions that enable all of us to get more of what we want. And one of the ways that you can really do that effectively is by optimizing to support the people who have been most unsupported in society. So not just women, for example, but women of color who are chronically underpaid in the United States. I think for Black women and Latina women, it's something like 50 something or 60 cents on the dollar relative to white men in terms of the pay gap. So if we think about building infrastructure and workplaces and policies that better support these people who have been most marginalized, that will in effect improve all of our outcomes because we're already more privileged by comparison. So if you start by trying to help those who are experiencing the worst inequalities, everybody else is going to be better served as a result. And so what I want us to imagine is how we really make that a priority in everything we do and understand that that is not in conflict with our own self-interest. It is not in conflict with our workplace's interests. It's actually a win-win-win.
Nice. Well, it would be nice to win in the game of life and in the corporate career. Thank you so much, Stefanie.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.